try it? Okay. I think we are ready, so let's get started. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hey guys, we still have one more talk.
Yeah. Yeah, so who heard about the new context API? Yeah? Yeah? Who's excited? Everyone who, like, less people? I guess you guys don't really know about new context API yet, right? Because when you hear about it, I think all of you will be very excited. So let's get started. Before we get into context, I found that a lot of people actually don't really understand the context. So I want to explain what you will generally do without using context. So if you use React for a while, you might have heard of this state called lifting state up. So this is what you will do when you have a state that is shared between two components. So in this case, let's say F and D are sharing a state. And then if that's the case, then you want to lift the state up. What I mean by that is that you want to move the state up to the lowest common parent, in this case A, to move the state up to the A and then pass it down as props to B and D and A to C to F. So this is, I just have a quote, but this is only quote I will have for today because I was kind of running out of time. But this is the quote I used before. So my quote is, unnecessary coupling is the root of all evil code. So in this case, I don't really like doing this because you're introducing unnecessary coupling. So for example, if you lift the state up to A and B and C actually don't really care about that state, but now they're coupled. They need to now be aware of that state, and now you have unnecessary coupling. So now we have context, but then the reason why I say new context is because there was old context. So this is how you will do using the old context. So you need four things. First, you need to provide what data type you want to pass down from the provider. So in this case, you will provide static child context types. And in this case, I'll just say that the type is object, and I'm passing down the date. Number two, you need to specify, in the provider, you need to specify get child context that returns the data that you want to put into the context as shown. And number three, in your consumer or your child, you now have to specify what type you want to receive from the context. And number four, you need to actually retrieve the data from this.context. So what's wrong with this? Sorry. Before I talk about why this is not good, I need to talk about why this is good. Okay, so context is really good because this allows you to avoid unnecessary coupling. So what I mean by that is that same situation, D and F will share, let's say they share a state. Instead of lifting the state up to A, we can simply use the context to inject the state directly to D and F. So that allows you to avoid unnecessary coupling because now A, B, C, they just stay as they are. They are not coupled to the state that D and F uses. if the context is so good, why aren't we all using it? Like, do anyone use context here? Okay, I mean, like that's more than I thought. But there's a reason why we don't actually implement context ourselves. What we actually do use it indirectly. Sorry, I jumped ahead. We actually do use it indirectly. Most of us actually do, because a lot of popular libraries actually use context. I'm just giving you some of the examples that I have used. React Redux, React JSS, React Router, React Navigation, X React, and hundreds of more libraries out there actually use context under the hood. So what's wrong? Like, they all use it, so it must be really good, right? Why aren't we using it? It's because Facebook told us don't use it. So I don't know if any of you actually read this before. I actually did, and that's why I didn't use it. It says don't use context 3 times. So yeah, that's why I didn't use it. So yeah, there's a reason why they said that. There are problems with the old context API. It was actually experimental. The first, number one, context is global. So what that means is that, remember that you were retrieving the context from this.context? Well, if you're using multiple, like if you have multiple libraries that are all using context, they're gonna conflict. Potentially conflict if they use the same variable name. Number two, both the provider and consumer needs to be aware of the context data and its type. So, I mean, like, you might still want to be aware of the type because you're receiving it, but at least you have a choice that you don't need to know the type. But in the old context API, you need to specify the type using the prop types, which is actually now you have to import the separate library for that, which is not really good, right? So third reason why it's not really good, or could be the old context has a problem, is that component may not re-render on context changes in certain scenarios. So for example, pure component. Have anyone heard of pure component? Yeah. So pure component actually does a shallow render of state and props, but context, they come in this context, not state or props. So if you actually do pure component, you may not get re-render. So that's a problem. So now we have the new context API. Before we talk about new context API, I need to talk about render props because they actually use render props. So render prop is this new kid in the town that is like, seems really cool. That is slowly getting popularity. Anyone know about render props here? Okay. I'm glad I put it in because I don't think many people actually know about this yet. So what render prop is the idea is actually really simple. It's actually easier than hardware component, but it's very similar. So let's say you have a location tracker, and that contains the state location. What render prop is you change this into that. So yeah, is that right? Oh, sorry. Okay, I only had like 1 day to prepare the slides, so I jumped ahead again. What I wanted to say was, let's say you have these 2 components, right? But then you want to change the code in a way that the app needs to be aware of the location because the app needs to do something with the location. So normally what I will do if I was a React newbie is this is what I will usually do. I will implement this thing called onChange location, and I will call that with the new location every time location changes. And that way the app receives that new location, and then now it can store that in a duplicated state and use that to render something else. Um, but you know, I kind of jumped ahead, so I kind of gave you a clue already. But this is not one of the best ways to implement stuff, because now you are kind of like have two duplicate locations. So by using render props, you can actually avoid this problem. I mean, like that's not the only way, but that's one of the way. So how would you do it using render props? So what render prop is actually passing a function as children, and then the function returns a component, and then the child actually calls that children function during the render cycle. So basically, for me, I think of it as this: the parent, instead of relying on child to take care of what to render, the parent is now deciding what to render in the child. But this is still composition. Like at first I was like, oh, isn't that like going against the React composition model? It's actually not, because the child is in the end still has to call this the props are children. So the child in the end still has the power to control what to render. It's just that you kind of have like a reverse role here. The parent is the one that is deciding what to render. So what's cool about this one is that now you don't have a duplicated state. But at the same time, you can actually reuse this location tracker in not just this project, but multiple different projects. So, this last code is actually exactly just copy paste from this top code, by the way, this top code. But doing it the left way is slightly worse than doing it the right way. You might think that they're exactly same. And it is in terms of what gets rendered, but it's not exactly. So what's the difference is that on the left side, you're creating this anonymous function that returns that H1 every single time you render. But then on the right side, I only do that once. And then when I do this render greeting, I'm only referencing that member function. So I only initialize that function once. So you might think that, oh, but I don't think that's a big difference. Like that creating the function is pretty quick, right? There is a difference if you're implementing a pure component, because on the left side, the function, the reference to the function will constantly change every single render. So you're pretty much like re-rendering every single time. Whereas on the right side, your reference to the function does not change every render. So it could make a difference. So generally prefer the right way. Okay, so finally, I can talk about the new context API. So to implement a new context API, you just need to remember 3 things. So you need to create provider and consumer components using React that create context. So React actually comes with context out of the box. Like this is React that you normally use. So on the top, it's a little bit cut off, but basically says, I'm calling this function React that create context, and I provide default state, and I get provider and consumer. Number 2, render provider at the higher level in the tree. This is exactly same as how you use React Redux. So you're just like basically provider at the top, or you can do it at the root or wherever you want, but it has to be higher up than the consumer. And then you pass in the value of whatever state you wanna pass down directly to your consumer. So number 3, you just render the consumer at the lower level. And then here, I'm doing that little bit of better way to reference the member variable, member function again. So this render greeting will render that H1. So this new context API is supported out of the box since React 16.3. No longer experimental, and prop types is optional. You can still do it, but you don't have to. So I think that's even better. But it is not a replacement for state management library. So there's 3 main advantages of using React Redux that I can think of. So number 1, remove unnecessary coupling by injecting state directly into the component, which actually can be replaced by the new context API, but not the other 2. So number 2, predictable state changes using pure functions and single immutable store, allowing easy debugging. So let's say you dispatch an action, you know the state before and after that action has been dispatched. So it's very easy to debug. And also if you use something like Redux DevTool, you can actually go back and see what exactly happened in multiple different action files. Number 3, ability to create middlewares to easily add additional features such as analytics. So again, you can intercept any action that is dispatched. So for example, you want to do analytics for page events. You can look for those actions for page events and you can fire analytics. So you might be wondering, okay, so when do I ever use the new context API? Because it seems like the React Redux is like a superset of new context API. You can do everything and more, right? So why would you even use it? So it's actually not easy. In fact, if you're not familiar with like Redux or any state management library, it's probably not even a good idea to even like try to use this new context API, because the benefit is not really there. It's just better to just use, just start learning about React Redux first. But I will tell you what I will think. But this is actually a little bit risky, because like most of you, I actually don't really use new context API that much because it's so new that this is just like things that I have been thinking about, and this is not really confirmed. So like don't really like do this like when I get it wrong. So one thing that I want to also mention is that 1 year ago I actually did a talk called, the title was a managing state in React, and there I talked about local state versus Redux and why you want to use both in what scenarios, and a bunch more. But then that's what I was thinking when I was writing this talk. So imagine, so in that talk, I don't know how, probably not many of you were in that talk, because it was a lot smaller back then. But basically, 2 things I talked about was when you don't share the state, you want to use local state, because that way you can use that component across multiple different projects. Whereas if you are using that state in multiple different components within your project, then you want to put it in Redux store. So for example, here you have the app and you have like A, B, C, D, F, G, all the way to the L. And you have the Redux store that is injecting state to A, B, C, D, and F. But connecting every single component to the Redux store, I mean, it's good because that way you can avoid the unnecessary coupling. But then at the same time, it is making them hard to reuse on different projects. Because imagine your components A, B, C, D, and F are now coupled to the Redux store, which is very specific to your current project, but but different for other projects. So it's kind of making it harder to reuse on different projects. But then, if you use a new context API and then only connect the provider, now it's getting easier. It's easy to now reuse across projects. I mean, it's not like just drag and drop. You still have to provide the value and pass the props, but it's easier than doing A, B, C, D, and F, right? So there's a benefit to using a new context API. So I didn't really have a time to actually implement this, but this is what I thought about, like, okay, where can I actually use this new context API? And I was thinking like, oh, maybe like I can use it on BirthdayCard. Like if I want to make a birthday card using React, this is what I can do. So I can create a provider and consumer, which when I create that, they're like they have a connection with each other under the hood. So you don't really have to worry about that, but they're somehow connected under the hood. And then I can create this draw cake component that will take the age in the render props and then render something. So what I was thinking when I had a draw cake is, imagine a cake with like the number of candles based on your age. So I'm 28 now. So I'm thinking like 8 candles and 2 giant candles. And then the second consumer component that I created is like happy birthday text, right? So it's like happy birthday, Eric, or something like that. But this is the thing. When I actually use this, I don't actually have to worry about where I put the consumer component. So here, I'm using the birthday card draw happy birthday text. I can actually encapsulate that in any component I want. So for example, let's say I want some background color in my text. Then I can like put put a div around it and put some background styling. And then underneath that, I can draw a cake. But I can even switch the order and it won't matter, because like I said, like it's context, so it will just inject the cell directly to the component. So if you think about it, I can take that birthday card class and then use it however I want. It's pretty exciting, right? So this is the last slide. So in summary, I believe the new context API allows us to reuse the code across multiple different projects, even at the same time while using Redux. And then a tip I want to also give you is focus on reusing the consumer. You can style it, you can like wrap it in whatever you want, and then you can export that consumer. And then that way you have like multiple consumers. I think having one consumer doesn't really cut it. Like it doesn't give a lot of benefit. But imagine you have a lot of consumers, and you can just put that anywhere you want. Like you can have like a carousel that has like a I don't know, breadcrumbs at the top or bottom. You can put whatever you want, but that is all using the state from the provider. So yeah, that is it. My name is Eric, and that's my email. That's my new context API presentation.
Any questions?
Hi.
Hi.
So with this new context API, do you know by any chance if there's the problem of overlapping, or in case when you have multiple providers, tons of consumers, Is there any possibility for conflict still somehow?
There cannot be conflicts because I just want to go back a little bit. When you create provider and consumer, they're somehow communicating with each other under the hood. So basically, you cannot have conflicts. In fact, you can actually nest multiple providers, and it won't even like. So here I'm using provider once at the top, right? But I can like have multiple providers, and then the closest like lowest child provider will be the one that actually injects into the consumer, and this consumer and that provider is linked, so it cannot conflict with any other context. So yeah, that's your answer.
It's not like a question, it's like something that I think it's important to mention is that this new API is like asynchronous. So if you, for example, you're building like a Telegram application and you click in a conversation, if you click nowadays, it will block the DOM. So you won't be able to click in another conversation until that request get done. And with this new context API, it's asynchronous. So you can click in whatever conversation you want. So it will be straight away. So this is a good point to mention.
That's cool. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't have much time to prepare, so I'm sure I missed a lot of things. But thanks for pointing that out. Here at the front.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some examples that we actually use in the new Evergreen. So we're using, I think like the canonical examples of the new create context is actually for theming, for example. So we had a question earlier about scanning in Evergreen. We're actually using the new context API. So if you're interested in that, how we do that, we pass on the theme. And additionally, you're using objects everywhere, but you can also actually pass functions in those providers. And additionally, I think like where it really shines is if you're building a system or you're building a library, you don't necessarily want to introduce like redux or something or for application logic, but more so than anything, I think it really shines in UI stuff. So for example, you can often run into, say you're building a dialog component and you want to stack another dialog on top of that and other layers on top of that. Now with the new context API, you can have an auto incrementing number every time you use, for example, a stack component you can design. So if you take a look in the new Evergreen, you can see a stack component that will always give you a higher Z index whenever you use it in a render tree.
That's really cool. Thank you. So if you look at the official React tutorial, they do mention about theming, and they do mention about like language, like I guess localization. So I didn't actually want to use that as an example because that will be like just like directly from the guide. So I had to think of something. So yeah, that's a really, really good example of using context-based API.
Hey, have you tried using this with any type checkers? I'm wondering how this integrates with like TypeScript, because you've got consumers that are trying to take in a value, but you don't always know it's provided.
Yeah, I'm not really good at TypeScript, but it definitely does work with flow type because it's easier, I think, to implement flow type in this kind of things. But I'm not really sure about TypeScript, sorry. But TypeScript, like whenever something comes up like this one, like usually there's what was it, like add types / whatever. So I think I'm sure like someone came up with it. So I wouldn't be worried about it. I'm sure there's something out there.
Does anyone use context API with?
It works? Okay. Someone confirm it works. Okay, good.
Any more questions? Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.